Okay, is it going? Okay, we are back. Okay.
Okay, we've had our pit stop.
Yes, pit stop. Okay, so we're just getting back to the Can-Am days. So during the Can-Am days, you had a shop, obviously. Where was that shop?
The shop was down in Scranton area and in Einan area.
And there was a life-changing incident that happened at that shop. Tell us a little bit about that.
The big boom theory.
Yes, the big boom theory.
The garage in Scranton was a concrete slab, no underground, nothing. And one September-wise I was coming to the garage and opening the door and smelling a lot of natural gas. So I called up the company. Oh, first of all, I looked around through my propane bottles and my welding tanks and all that. And I said, no, it's got to be external. So I called the company and they had a guy come over. This is the beginning of September, early fall. And he came over, walked in the door, took a couple stiffs. Oh yeah, he said, you got a gas leak. Where's your water? Because gas and water are using the same plumbing digging. He says, I have no water, I have no gas. This is just a slab. He says, oh, I'm an inside man. We got to contact the outside people to see where the lines are in this area. That was a Thursday afternoon. Thursday went, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Came in, it was raining. I didn't open the doors, didn't ventilate the place.
Mm-hmm.
Walked over to my bandsaw, which was on a bench next to the cinder block wall. Flipped the switch, and there was a big boom. And prior to that, I was cleaning U-joint pieces on a bench about 15, 20 feet away. And so it couldn't have been me, that's too far away. What the hell blew? So I crawled out. It was starting to burn, and I crawled out of the building. And obviously the natural gas blew up. A guy's daydreaming out this window across the street. He says, I saw your roof go straight up about 15 feet. And then it came down, of course, and all the walls crumbled and a big cloud of smoke and fire and all. He says, but I was amazed at how it went straight up. And of course, that's what happened. All the cinder block walls had filled, and they all went at one time.
Now you were not alone in that.
And
in the
I
garage,
was
right?
at ground zero. Somebody would ask, my dog was there as well,
Okay.
little Toro. And he was laying underneath my desk where he always laid. And people asked, how was the concussion? And I said, I felt no concussion. The way I could only describe it, I said, if you were sitting in a plane and it blew a window, you would hear this rush of air. He said, well, you were ground zero. Everything was moving out away from you on the concussion. 6 feet, 10 feet away would have probably knocked you over.
Wow.
That air rush.
Yeah.
And of course, I spent the next 10 weeks in the hospital with burns. My dog, of course, I wasn't concerned at that moment in time. But a couple of days later, one of our local pole men, he was up a pole doing some electric work and looked down at some bushes, and he saw something down there, and he went down, and it was Toro, my dog. And he said, oh, this must be the dog the Boy Scouts are looking for.
Wow.
So he was burnt, his nose was pink like a clown, his ears were charred, and they were going to put him away. And the Boy Scout people said, no, no, no.
And they saved him.
So they kept them. Uh, there, that poster or that picture there is my wife Terry with him.
Yeah.
He survived.
What,
Good doggy.
what do you think saved you in that accident? What do you think saved you?
What did what?
So what do you had said to me that
See, he's not
what-
talking about.
okay, all right. So you had said to me what saved you, the roof came down on the McLaren that was in the shop.
Yeah, that was a Mark 6 McLaren
Tell us a little bit about that.
on wooden jack stands or wooden horses. The horses collapsed. The roll bar got bent over a little bit, and that assisted in holding the beam and the roof on one side and the refrigerator on the other side, so that they gave the roofs a good V shape, and I had the ability to crawl out.
Now you were in the hospital for quite a while.
10 weeks.
10 weeks. So a very special person entered your life at that point. Terry, your wife. How did you meet?
Well,
How did you meet Terry?
She was in my life prior to that, but she turned to be. She worked at Auto World with Oscar,
Mm-hmm.
and she did her job as being a promoter for Oscar and for Can-Am. And with my burns and all, she helped get me through the 10 weeks of survival.
And how did that story happen? Where Oscar, what did Oscar said to Terry? Here's some magazines. Take my buddy Jack's in the hospital. I want you to bring some magazines to him. Remember you telling me about that?
Print a magazine?
So Oscar gave Terry some magazines and said, take him to my buddy Jack. He's in the hospital, and that's how he introduced you and Terry.
That's a probability, but no, I knew Terry prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we met skiing at Elk Mountain.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, she lived here in Carbondale, worked at Auto World, and yeah, we went on the February gathering at Elk Mountain skiing is where we worked, but we did know each other through Auto World prior to that. And Oscar, being the promoter he is, he would make sure I got good care. The hospital wanted to send me down to the burn unit in Allentown, and he looked at the what do you got a hospital here, don't you? Isn't that what you're supposed to do? You have the Hubbard baths, you have the facility. So I was their first burn victim
Really?
at
Wow.
Scranton Hospital.
Wow.
And during that time period, the doctor heard about my dog,
Mm-hmm.
so he thought it would boost my morale if I saw Toro was all right. So later I found out they had him pretty heavily sedated,
Oh,
but he was the first dog to be brought into the hospital.
really? Wow. That's really cool. Wow. So, after that, you continued to work with Oscar after you got
Yeah.
better, and
Yeah.
The next, I guess the next chapter would be the Miller brothers, and your involvement with Paul and Kemper Miller. Is that correct? Tell us a little bit about that.
Seemingly I'm a little confused likewise about the time frames, but apparently out of Oscar and out of Can-Am, I'm not sure who I was up at Watkins Glen, because that was my favorite track. I was always up there for anything. And Paul and Kemper Miller were involved with Ray Besta's team of two Corvettes. And a mutual friend came over to me and says, would you be interested in doing some Corvette work? And Judy Beatty introduced me to Paul and Kemper Miller on doing those Corvettes. So that's basically how I got involved with Paul and Kemper. They're Gannett Corporation, the USA Today and all that.
Mm-hmm.
The cars we could have had in the past, he had a nice little Lancia coupe. laid in the garage. Hey, Jack, you want that? You know, just old race cars. They don't have interest.
Yeah.
Should have had that.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what we were talking about before. There's nothing worse than
Nothing worse.
last
Nothing
year's.
more obsolete than last year's race car.
Exactly. So tell me a little bit about Paul and Kemper, as far as, you know.
Paul always had the more interest in racing, and Kemper was yes and no, but when he decided to go racing on his own, Paul had already separated and gone the Porsche route, and Kemper decided he wanted his own car, and that's when he bought the CSL from Peter Gregg, and we got into that program.
Mm-hmm. Now, the early days. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought. Sorry.
Go ahead. I know my brain's bouncing around. I have to read my own history to find out where I am. A brain? When did I get a brain?
Well, so you ran the Camaro with Paul and Kemper.
Paul and Kemper, yeah.
And that was in IMSA, correct?
IMSA.
IMSA, okay. So,
IMSA GT.
Okay.
GTO or whatever it was. The Camaro ran pretty well. We were accused of not cheating but stealing other people's designs.
Mm-hmm.
We ended up having a big 454 engine in it, set back about 12 inches. The rule book said it couldn't be set back farther than the tip of the windshield.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked, is that where the glass stops of the windshield or where the hood overlaps the windshield?
Right.
And I don't really remember where it is, but I think it was where they wanted. So I ended up, and you weren't allowed to add metal back then.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up going onto the roll cage of the Trans Am, putting a piece of heavy wall tubing would have come along
And pulling it back.
on the firewall, kept heating, and bent the firewall back
Right.
that far. The front dampener on the Chevy V8 was eating into the cross member of the front suspension. That's how far back it was.
Wow.
And with the dry sump oil pan, that's how low it was.
Wow.
But when we ran Lime Rock, which is a tight little course, we were in. They ran 2 heats because of lack of pit area for pit stops.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the first heat, we were in 7th place, and every car in front of us was a Porsche RSR.
Yeah.
So we were the fastest of the American big cars around Lime Rock.
Wow.
And at Daytona, we were clocked at 192 down the straight.
Wow. That's fast.
So
for a
I
truck
did a
like that.
decent job with the Camaro as well.
Wow. So you actually continued on with, Paul did his own thing after that.
Yeah,
Now
Paul
we're-
went out on his own.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Kemper got involved with David Cowart
Mhm.
with the March prototype cars
So,
and with the M1.
right. So tell us a little bit about. So we're at the period from the early so the Miller brothers were from the early 70s to about the mid 70s, and then from the mid 70s that's when that was when David Coward came into the picture, correct?
I think it was basically just general work on
Yeah.
various different cars, nothing major.
And that was the time that you came here in Carbondale.
Well, I got married in '71.
Okay.
We were involved while still down in Einan after the blow up. I got involved with a garage in Einan, halfway between Carbondale and here. And out of there came some of Kemper's cars, his street with Ferrari I worked on, an ex-David Hobbs Formula A I worked on down there. And I think the early days of the M8B, The Mark 6 was in the explosion. And in the early days, that's the time period he bought the MAB. So the MAB was being done primarily first out of Einen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I ended up buying the facility I'm in now. Incoming, excuse me, Sarah.
Yep.
This is the Cecil B. DeMille's production of Jack Deren.
Now's when we have a commercial break.
Oh, come on over, ASP.
McDonald's orange juice. It is the best.
Oh, we'll be done probably then, but they'll be here. It's Rodriguez and his wife.
David's
Got
gonna
the
do a.
cameras and the
You want to do a
lights,
Sig
the
Sauer
little
commercial for us?
microphones on my chest, and we're doing an interview. No, they'll be here. Yeah, we'll probably do lunch, yes. No, come on over, ASP. Hokey dokey.
You want a chair?
No, I'm okay.
1:30. That's Sarah, she'll be on over.
Okay. All right. So where were we?
Okay, where were we when my train of thought
Talk
got
about the
derailed?
maybe and
You were talking about the shop in between Scranton and Pier.
That would be the Einen years and various street work and nothing major until the M8B arrived. Because Oscar, after the blast, he wanted to keep me happy, keep the car going. So we had Lothar Machenbacher one time in the Einen garage for one of the Can-Ams. So it was that early days. Then in 1971, coming up to here, I'm belching my water. That's when Can-Am kind of deteriorated likewise and got involved with the March Boys.
Mm-hmm.
In that time period, Oscar was still going off to various little places with Bertel Roos, the driver instructor from Pocono.
Mm-hmm.
And they did one or two of the races, but I was not involved with Oscar back then. I got involved with Kemper and Paul and David.
Okay.
Paul was involved initially, but not much.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Kemper and the Kemper and David years. So tell me a little bit about David Coward.
Well, in running the CSL and in running the Porsche Carreras, Coward ran the Porsche and Kemper ran the CSL, and they got to be knowing each other, and that's what got them together to get into the M1, and they both ran the M1, and with the success we had with the M1, BMW offered 2 motors as thanks, and their connection with March at that point in time is when they convinced March to put a BMW motor in one of those 1983, 82 March prototypes. So of the 4 cars March built that year, 3 of them had Chevys and 1 of them had a BMW, which we should have kept. The car still exists. And we ran that for a while. Kemper was usually and always to me, the faster driver. But David was the bringing in of the Red Lobster sponsorship with his connection in restaurants. David's background was his father has the Admiral Benbow Inns and Morrison cafeterias in Florida. So he was in the restaurant business. And at the restaurant gathering one December, at the end of the IMSA CSLs and Porsche days, he was at this restaurant gathering and saw a friend that he went to college with and said, "Hey, Dick," it was Dick Monroe. "Hey, how you doing? What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm a menu director at Red Lobster." And David at that point in time had already talked to Kemper about buying a BMW M1 because that looked like going to be a good car for the following year. And Dick's reply immediately was, or David asked, "You want to be a sponsor?" And they says, "Well, that's why I'm here. We're at this convention looking for other ways of advertising for Red Lobster other than normal restaurant-oriented publications." So that's how David got us involved with Red Lobster. And the first year that we ran the M1, it came in as an ex-pro car. Pierre DeAngelis or something, BMW of Italy, ran it. And we ran 4 races with it as it was received in pro car spec. And IBSA had 1 class at that point in time, and we had to run against the turbo 935 Porsches, which obviously was not going to happen.
Of course.
But we were in 4th place several times, did show a good results. And for 80, that was the 4 years we ran it. And then 81 is when the winter of 80 and 81 is when I get my IMSA blessings on it. And we had a rather successful year.
And you also won Mechanic of the Year in
Well,
81.
We were winning one race after another for quite a while. The first 2 motors that we got were coming out of Munich unhappily. I talked McLaren engines in Livonia with our connections with them out there. Can they do another BMW motor? Because they were doing the 2-liter motors for IMSA, the Formula cars.
Mm-hmm.
And they agreed, so they were doing our motors. The best motor I ever saw on their dyno was a 491 horsepower. And I would go out and get the motors, put them in the cars, and we ran and ran. And at the 6-hour Glen race, where the European guys come over, their M1 crashed. And rather than haul it all the way back to Germany, they asked if I could get it back together and repaint it and make it sellable. So I did that, and while I was doing that, Eric Wensberg was their director at the time, and he says, if you need any parts, feel free. So I was carrying their motor and transmission as a spare parts for our effort. And I think it was at Mid-Ohio where we had an engine problem, and I said, well, Eric said we can use parts, so the motor is a part.
Right.
So we installed the motor that Hans Stuck and those guys were running for the 6-hour.
Wow.
And that's the motor that we ran and ran and ran and ran 6 competitive racing without pulling the motor.
Wow.
Now, I don't want to point fingers, but the motors we were getting out of Munich weren't doing the job.
Yeah.
The motors we later got out of McLaren finished our seasons.
Wow.
And that's one of the basic things I think that stuck with Kemper and Paul with his effort with Lamborghini. He says, we're not the factory team. The factory team is always running a little bit faster than us. And at one of the events, Paul pressured the mechanic friends. He says, well, don't tell anybody. Give me the car a minute. Well, he said he wasn't at the car for a matter of minutes.
Mm.
And must have done something in the computer, and suddenly we were running better.
Wow.
He says, now this is not racing.
Yeah, well, just a computer with 4 wheels on it today. So, I want to just go back just a little bit to, you know, to Kemper's CSL, the 3.5 CSL that ran in the 24 hours of Daytona. Tell me about how Kemper acquired that car.
Well, we were racing IMSA with the Corvette, and we wanted to go update and get something better, and that was 76. And I have a nice photo at Daytona, the behind the pits, right hand 180-degree turn with our car in the photo, because that's the photo I'm taking, and the roof of a CSL behind him going around on the inside. So he says, I'd like to stay in racing and it'd be nice to be in a winning car. So he made a deal with Peter Gregg to buy the car. And when we went down there, sitting in Peter's office, they're making the deals. And Peter says, well, who's going to work on the car? And Kemper said, well, Jack. And Peter looked at me and said, well, he's a Chevy mechanic. What does he know about BMWs? And I says, well, bolt's a bolt and nuts, so I'll figure it out. So we got a pile of spares that Peter had, luckily, and we had success with the car.
I just want to, yep, lights on, good. I just wanted to check your mic because I wanted to make sure the light's on, so we're good. So the next thing, so do you remember what Kemper paid for that car back then, all those years ago?
What Kemper paid for it? Oh boy. I've always tried to keep out of the pay factor of racing. You know how they put on the side of the car the driver and the car and the mechanic, the mender, the bender, and the spender?
Yeah.
Well, I'm the mender. So I never really followed the comp on what they actually paid. I know what he sold it for.
And that's the only reason I'm asking is just because these cars,
I think it was.
yeah, the cars are so expensive now and so special and everything else. Back then, it was once again last year's race car,
Right.
obsolete,
Right.
and that's the reason I was asking you.
Well, he bought it at a good price, I'm
Yeah.
sure. And we did run it as received. Part of the deal was that Peter's crew would take care of it for the 24-hour, and then we would take care of it. And it had its normal transmission and clutch problem, adapter problems. It didn't finish the 24-hour, but we were impressed with it. And when I got involved with it, again, we ran a couple races as received. And then over the winter, going through it deeper, we were complaining about the gate track transmissions that were their weak point. And talking with the McLaren boys, he says, well, we're playing with that 320i turbo car, and it's got all kinds of horsepower, so you should be able to handle that with one of these transmissions. And I think Gary Knudsen or Wiley McCoy, one of the two, said the problem, it'll bolt to your bell housing, but the pilot bushing is going to have to get worked on because our pilot shaft's diameter is a bigger shaft. It's something flying in. And I have a lathe here in the shop where I had to set up the transmission to be driven by the output shaft to spin the input shaft and anchor it all down, find it on center with the centers, and get the tool post grinder out to grind that diameter down to get into a CSL bushing.
Wow.
And that thing just ran and ran and ran. In the prior year, knowing I had to carry a spare transmission, I made up a nice wooden box, all lacquered and all varnished, not to carry a spare transmission. And to rebuild it, somebody had it rebuilt after a blow. It was sent off to gate track in Germany, and they rebuilt the trans, did a nice job, no problem, and it came back to me in a nice cardboard box. They saved my nice little.
They kept
saved-
it.
yeah.
Yeah, they kept it. So, we talked about some of the modifications that you had done on the CSL. How did it do with when
In
you had raced that car with Kemper from
With
from 77,
78, 79,
right?
and into 80.
Yeah.
And I just brought out, I think I just brought out somewhere. And it had a pile of,
Here's this one. This one. There you go.
oh no, I'm sorry, look, the paper, just like that.
Is it under there, Jack?
Kemper,
Let me see.
no, I don't
Under
know where it
yours.
is.
No.
In 78 and 79, Kemper and IMSA broke many track records,
Mm-hmm.
pole positions, all that. They ran very well. In our first test session at Atlanta, Bob Tullius was running their brand new TR7 that he was going to race, and Kemper kind of kept them behind him. And Tullius came over to Kemper and said, "You going to run that at IMSA all year?" I said, "Well, yeah, that's why we bought the car." He says, "Dad, if I can't beat a 3-year-old race car, I'm going to go Trans Am." So he did. He left IMSA and went Trans Am.
Wow. So
It ran well. And in recent years, Kemper now sold it to Kevin Ladd. And in the time period right around that, he had gotten invited to the Daytona 26 Minutes, where they run cars of invitation
Mhm.
in a pre-event to the 24-hour. And with Kevin having the car for a couple years in a barn, left alone, he called to get the car running for that event. Now he got it to run, and there was an incident with the motor that I'll get into a little earlier or later. At any rate, we got the car down there, and Brian Redmond was going to drive it because of his history with the car, and they all gridded up, and all the cars that year by invitation were ex 24-hour winners. So I told Brian, says, "Take it easy on this motor. I have no idea hours wise on this M49 motor, and they're made of platinum and gold, and the new owner doesn't want to have anything happen to the motor, so treat it with a little respect."
Right.
So their green flag drops, and of course it's behind a pace car. And it's funny how those pace cars go so fast, they get way out in front. So the cars behind them have to try to catch up.
Right.
So in the first lap, a GT40 and a BMW CSL went flying by, and here comes the rest of the pack. So Brian immediately tied up with a GT40,
Wow.
and they were going at him at more than touring speed.
So much for taking it easy,
Yeah.
right?
So he pulls into the pits after a couple laps that they had to run, and his first comments, he looked up and says, "Jack, this runs better than the factory car." He says, "Yeah, it handles better, has good power."
Yeah.
So that's when I told him about the motor. In the 2 years that Kevin had it sitting in a barn, and he brought it down, "Jack, get it started and run it up." I had trouble getting it to start, and it would always just boom, kick right off. And check the valve time, check this. I called Marcus to say, "Is it possible that the timing gear got out of mesh or something?" He said, No, none of that would be possible. So in all this cranking that I was doing, I'm obviously on one side of the car, the exhaust is on the other side. And when I walked around that it was, there's this pile of debris laying on the floor out of the exhaust pipes. I says, you gotta be kidding. Exhaust on race cars are open right up to the valve. The mice find the valve, and no matter where you stop a motor, there are valves that are off the seats. 2 of those cylinders had mice living on top of the pistons.
Mm.
The combustion, or the intakes, you could all see the fuzz around them from my cranking over. The mice are living in a 6-apartment condo called BMW. So I took the plugs out, bumped the car in gear till I knew both valves were opening on the overlap, and took the air line, just blew in the spark plug, blew in the intake, and tried to clean out the combustion chamber until it could crank over nice and clean with no evidence of coming out. And that's how I got that motor running. That's why I was worried about it. And today, it's running just fine.
Yeah.
The quality of a good BMW motor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those motors are being built by Hans Zeres, a dealership in New Jersey. And in recent years, I didn't realize his history, but it must have been pretty deep. Whenever I would mention this, what I'm saying now, that Hans Zeres built the motors, their eyes would pop open. Hans Zeres? Oh, so we're looking for him. And they wanted to find him and talk, but I've lost contact, whether he's around yet or not.
Yeah.
But they were the good years of my introduction to BMW.
Yeah. And that car certainly did have an amazing life. It still
It has
does.
an amazing life till
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. It had an interesting history. It still has an interesting. So Kemper sold the car, and he's the first time actually Kemper sold the car was to Joe Spaulding.
Joe Spaulding, yes.
Tell me the story about Joe Spaulding and the character that Joe Spaulding is, or was, I should say.
Well, again, that's back in the open days of sniffing and dope and all that. And you could see just by his attitude, Joe, he was very high strung. And in our way of looking at it, he must be on high on something or other.
Now,
but he loved that car.
But Joe Spaulding was Joe Spaulding Sporting Goods.
Yes.
That family of
Yeah,
of
they lived in
sporting goods.
Fort Lauderdale.
Yes. Okay.
And he, bouncing around, oh, this BMW is so great, I gotta have it, I gotta buy it. So he talked with Kemper, and they made a deal, and Kemper got a check and put it in his pocket and went home. And a couple weeks later, he calls me up, he says, I was looking at this check and haven't heard from the guy and wondering what's going on, and is he gonna buy it or not? So I'll check it out. So, behind the scenes with business people, you don't call the bank. His secretary will call his secretary, and they will check back and forth. And he did have the check checked out. And they called back, oh, Joe, oh yeah, he could write checks for 10 times that amount, don't worry about it, deposit it. I think it was 500 or 600. So he obviously deposited, and then it became my chore to deliver it. So we took it down to, it wasn't St. Lauderdale, Pompano Beach or something. He's up the coast a little. It was in that area. I unloaded the car, and Joe hops in it. I showed him how to start it up and run it and all that, where the gears and all. And he took off, and you could hear it screaming, and down the road he went, and down the road he went. And we're waiting and wait a good half hour.
In a race car.
in the CSL race car.
That won 24 hours in 76. 24. Yeah.
And he finally came back, and the car was panting heavily like a dog would be panting.
Yeah.
And he said, his comments were, the police aren't going to catch me in this thing.
That's great. what ultimately
So
happened?
he ended up getting killed in a street accident.
Yeah.
The car laid out in the field for 2 or 3 years, and Kemper bought it back.
Mhm.
And
What kind of shape was it in when you got it?
it had a lot of field rash.
Yeah.
The top of the steering wheel was all peeled back.
Yep.
I'm not sure where that, if Kemper has it or
Kevin took it. Kevin has it.
Kevin has it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, it needed a lot of tender, loving care to put it back together and get it running again.
Mm-hmm.
But we did, and it runs just fine
Yep.
on the same engine build.
Again, a car that really has had an amazing
Yeah,
life.
it has a good life.
Yeah. Yep.
And some people questioned whether it was the real car or not. And, there was enough evidence in the car. In a recent Bimmer book where they were talking about the varying cars, and they had commented about testing with ABS brakes. And I do remember in getting the car, in the left rear corner of the trunk, up over the wheel well, were the pumps and all that for ABS brakes. That and other instances in the car that prove that we do have the proper CSL.
The rocker panel on the passenger side was crushed, correct? It
From
took-
various accidents, that
yeah.
they could prove that yes, this is the Daytona
Yeah.
winner.
Now, what as far as modifications, what modifications did Kemper? Did he do any trimming the drip rails on the roof?
Well, in
was that Greg or was that
In that one
Kemper?
winter build over of adding the tubes with the roll cage, I made a little heavier than the FIA down runners and ran runners out to the suspension point, crossbarred passenger compartment. Things like the motor and trans are mounted pretty far forward for the motor, and the trans in the back on one bolt on the belly pad.
Mhm.
And you could see the cracks all around that
Stress.
motion. So I obviously welded up all the cracks and put a vertical tube up to the roll cage to support that point. And got rid of the rubber mounts a little bit more. Little things like that, nothing major.
Mhm.
At one point, well, that was on your car where we put a Corvette rear in one.
Yeah.
Moments of sanity,
Yeah.
covered by insanity.
But you had said that car had all the same whiskers that it had back in 75, 76, pretty much. It
Yeah.
really was not, it was very much original in a lot of ways, correct?
Well, the cars that BMW brought over for CSL were built to the IMSA spec. They were vertical motors, not on an angle. So in doing the vertical motor, they got into a deeper dry sump system. They got a different cross member. They had power or rack and pinion steering, which all the other CSLs don't have. I got involved in recent years with Scott Hughes CSL. That was a 72. And it was an ex-Le Mans winner that Scott has yet. And we did his maintenance for a couple of years. But that had the angled motor and the older transmission. And you could see the varying differences between the two cars over the years.
So, moving into, still staying with BMW, the M1, tell me about what happened to the first M1. The first M1 that Kemper had, the accident that
What did I do to it? My chop?
part of it, yes. So there were actually two M1s that you guys
Well,
were.
the first one we got was chassis 040, and that's the one that I converted into the IMSA winning GTO car at that moment in time. That car got sold then to Tony Garcia the following year, and Diego Montoya drove it. And at the same time, IMSA had made rule changes of no more big wing in the back. You had to get rid of the wing. And they all complained about how the car won't handle anymore because of the wing. I remember Don Devenworth, California Porsche guy, one time measuring the wing in the pit air. Oh, I wish I had a wing this big, you know. But they ran it a while. And Tony came over to us one time at one of the races and says, Jack, you had stock suspension in that car. I said, well, yeah, that's what I kept telling you. I said, I made a minor change, but that was for accessibility and for workability, quick. And Tony said, I could not believe that David Coward could drive better than me. So we figured you must have had special. He said he had hired a Ford engineering suspension engineer, and they had repositioned all the suspension pickup points.
Wow. Wow. And that brings me to another question, actually. So today, these race teams, and even back then, but for every track, there's a different setup on the car. They set everything up differently for each track. Tell us a little bit about how you set things. Did you set up the car? Did you change things a lot from track to track?
Well, as a matter of evidence to me, as the mechanic, without computer feedback of cars that they have nowadays, when we had the car there for the Sebring event, they usually get you involved with a third driver. Was it Sebring or Daytona? Either one. It must have been Daytona. We got there early enough, and David would take the car out and run it for the half-hour practice session, the full half hour. Kemper would take it out and run the full half hour, and they'd sit with their brains and our brains. Well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? The next morning, our third driver came in, a guy by the name of Derek Bell. A driver. He gets in the car and takes off. I'd see him go by once, I see him go by twice, comes back, third lap, and he's coming in. I said, oh, was there something wrong? Car running all right? He said, oh, the car's running fine, but I think we need this, or we need that. Let's maybe try. And I said, well, back up. Our spares package hasn't arrived from Munich yet. Had to be Daytona 24 hours. And Derek, with his lovely British accent, says, oh, it's one of those days. But there's the driver sitting there, and honestly, you could see him drop down and start thinking, why did I ask for this? Why did I ask for that? And he went out and in a couple of laps was going 7 seconds faster.
He adapted.
7 seconds faster.
Yeah.
And he's the one that told me the phrase, drive what you've got.
Right.
Forget about looking for perfection in how to get around something. If you can't get around something, then change it around, change your line, drive what you got.
Yeah.
And David said, well, maybe we could do this or do that. And Derek looked at us and said, David, when you get 7 seconds faster, we'll worry about changing anything.
Right.
There's 7 seconds in the car. Find it. What do you do with drivers like that? What am I going to do now? The same thing happened when later, afterward, when I got involved with the Spirit of Miami car with Emerson Fittipaldi. He did the same thing in our test session at Moroso. Couple laps come in. And he said, it feels a little heavy. And in their vocabulary, heavy was rich
Right.
and a mixture.
Yeah.
And we opened the hood, and the Lucas fuel injection has 5 adjustments on on the meter, and we were in the cold start rich mixture. Did nothing but put it in the middle one, went back out, ran about 3-4 laps, says everything's good, it's handling great, blah blah blah. It that driver, and the interesting thing too with both of them, as soon as they would stop in the pits, oil pressure's this, oil temperature, it'd read all the gauges off for you.
Right.
David and Kemper, I think the needle was over here.
Well, going back to setting the car up and adjusting things with David, I wanted to just, I remember a story that you had told me about David, where he wanted you to adjust something in the suspension.
Well, when you set the adjustable shocks and adjustable spring rates,
Right.
You set the car on right height blocks to get rid of the springs, to do your wheel alignment and all that. And then when you put it up, you're going to put it on scales, and to get proper weight on the scales, you take the drag links off your sway bar, one of the links off, so you're not putting a twist into the frame. And we get it all done. David took it out on the first practice session of the following race, and he says, I think we could use a stiffer sway bar in the rear. So I went back with the wrench to look. Ooh, the link is still dangling. I never put it back on.
Right.
Which means no sway bar.
That's
It's
true.
soft
Yeah.
as you can get it.
Yep.
So I hooked it up again, and Kemper saw what I was doing. Didn't say anything yet. David went back out and said, oh, that's much better. So this is the driver feedback I had to deal with.
Right. And you had very different drivers too,
Two
between
different drivers, yes.
very different drivers.
Yeah, they would talk gear ratios, well, maybe a longer second gear, third gear. This is on the march where you can change gears quickly. Changing gears on an M1 is a nightmare.
Mhm.
But they were never the same in their feedback.
Who is the best driver that you ever dealt with? As just
Had to be those two,
yeah.
Emerson and Deren by far.
Yeah.
The bit with Bondurant and the McLaren going faster immediately. Oscar was a good driver. He could have been a very good driver if he wanted to be a race driver. But he was heavily involved with Auto World, and in the back of your mind is always the
Promoting.
business. Like we ran the whole season without banging up the nose. And the nose we had on it was one that Bruce gave us out of Detroit, because they were running 2 or 3 laps or 2 or 3 events and give it away because the fiberglass gets soft. They weren't carbon fiber back then.
Right.
And he says, I can see the downforce on the fender. No, it's getting too soft. So they'd give us the old ones. And we would run and run and run. Photo up there with Oscar.
Yep. So
On the M1, the only thing I did on the M1, the production M1s are for touring, where I'm sure at the factory when they go through their wheel alignment procedure, it's all rubber bushing A-frames. And in particular, the rear A-frames are basically 4 points. You got 2 on the chassis and 2 on the bottom of your upright. And the A-frame between was a solid A-frame with 4 pickup points in it. So to do any toe-in adjustments at the rear end, when you move the wheel, you're moving the inside mounts on the chassis. And you'd have to pull the bolt, change shims on either side so the tie bolt would hold it tight in between, because the bolt is in a slot for pulling out and in for camber change, let alone caster change. Caster change, you didn't really have any adjustment other than on the top A-frame. So the basic thing I did at the rear was cut little spacers to hold the chassis pins out at the maximum to get maximum track at the bottom of the outer A-frames. And on the A-frame itself, it has the triangular affair coming in from the bottom of the upright to the shock point or pickup point. So the other chassis mount is just holding the wheel for towing changes. So I cut that off, cut the transfer bar off, and made a hind joint there. So for a toe-in change, all I had to do was loosen 2 jam nuts, turn the center bar,
right.
tighten it up, and they could see a change in toe-in immediately.
Right.
Maybe 10 minutes at most.
Mm-hmm.
So they could go through that in test sessions and practice sessions. The upper was a little bit more awkward in that you had to make an operating that you could pop it out of the upright and and put it back in for camber. And again, the stock uprights are solid. You couldn't make that adjustment. So they were the only adjustments I made to the rear. On the front, I really can't pin down other than not much you could do up there because it had the one long bolt for centering the rack. They have a little screw bolt that goes into a point on your steering rack to anchor the steering rack, so you can do one wheel at a time without one affecting the other.
Right.
Which helps a lot. And then just the general accessibility to get at all those points during a pit stop or during maintenance in the garages there, because we don't have 30 people in the crew. It was just me and Al and whoever we pick up as helpers at an event.
Right.
So the fastest repair job we did with the M1 was at Monterey. Left front, David came in and he said, there's something wrong with the front end. If I just breathe on the brake pedal, it gets a heavy lock up on the front wheels and it starts pulling. Well, the caliper broke off the upright. The bounce of the magnesium upright broke. So naturally, as soon as you touch the brakes, it would bang against the A-frame and bang. So as soon as we diagnosed and saw what was happening, our van was parked maybe like from here to the Burger King away. And I said, go down underneath the bench, blah, blah, blah. There's an upright there with A-frames hanging on it. Pull the whole thing back here. So while they did the return, we changed the entire left front end in about 9 minutes.
Well, that reminds me of a story that you told me about David Cowart, about the engine and what happened with the. I hear a noise. You remember that?
That was the M1.
Tell me a little bit about that.
We were at the 24-hour, and thinking of time-wise, it was into the evening hours, and David was driving, and he calls in on the radio, and Kemper's on the radio, and they're talking back and forth. He said there was a little flash of fire in the rear view mirror, and I hit the fire button, and the glow went out, caused it to a stop, but now it won't start because it must have burnt a wire. So I gave the phones to Kemper, and I'm gathering up clip leads and wires and some tape and all that to try to get out to the car to get it runnable. And Kemper's yakking away, and people watching Kemper, the IMSA guy that monitors every pit action. He says, I was watching Kemper, and his face is getting redder and getting redder. And finally, I heard him yell into the phone, David, you blew the effing motor.
And so boy, did he. Yeah. Okay, he really lunched that
So
one.
later when it came in, I said, "Hey David, you know why it wouldn't start? Why? Because the motor was laying over on the chassis. It blew the motor right up. The connector rod broke.
What did David say to you after that?
Well, that was a previous blow up.
Oh, that was another one.
Oh yeah, yeah. The motor, the the rod broke, and it whipped itself a path. Cut the pan literally in half. Came up the sides of the block and got tucked in behind the engine. Almost cut the block halfway up.
Wow.
It was a little explosion and a fire.
Yeah.
The other one was the previous M1 at Daytona. And he pulled in, gets out of the car, added our fuel. Kemper got into the car, started the motor. You could see his eyes go big, and reaches for this master quick shuttle. Says, "Did you hear that?" I said, "It sounded a little noisy back there." So we ended up pulling the cam cover, and the intake or the exhaust, one of the valves, was just shrapnel everywhere. Tappets broken, valve springs, all. And he said, "David, was this running all right?" I said, "Well, yeah, it really was making some noises, but not. It was still running." The same thing with the Porsche turbo Porsche, when he had that motor in the March at Lime Rock. David's not going to like this, you know.
Sorry, David.
He just didn't have a great mechanical aptitude.
We're sorry.
We're at the truth in saying sorry. We have free speech. God bless the Constitution.
Didn't he tell you he'd be in the motorhome? He said he would be in the motorhome if you got it fixed.
If you get it running, I'll be in the motorhome.
Yeah.
That's his lack of understanding, really, of mechanics. The Porsche powered March at Lime Rock, which isn't the course for that kind of car, and comes in, and again we hear noise and hear something, and David, was this thing running all right? And I says, well, it seemed to be down on power, but it seemed okay. What the hell was it that broke? Anyhow, he was down on 5 cylinders, because one cylinder, I think the exhaust pipe broke off, and he wasn't getting any boost out of that one.
Mm-hmm.
But it was something in the board stroke as well that was literally running on 5 cylinders. Down on power a little bit. So he was going from turbo boost to no boost power, and his comment was down on power a little bit.
Well, this brings us into the next thing, which is the March cars.
That wasn't a March car.
Correct. So let's talk a little bit about the 82 and the 83G March cars. Tell me a little bit about the 83 March. It was the Red Lobster sponsored car, of course. Tell me a little bit about the...
Well, we had Red Lobster sponsorship, and for the 82 car, wasn't doing well with the power it had, and we were going to put a turbo Porsche motor in it for the following year. But in the meantime, in the keeping of interest by Red Lobster, we had to make some show, because the turbo car wasn't ready yet. And they bought the Al Holbert Chevy March, and we ran that. Well, I'm getting all this sequence of
Now,
stuff here going.
That was the CRC car? Is that
The
correct?
CRC car.
Okay.
Why the time frame of the two? Because we picked up the CRC car on the way to Elkhart or Brainerd, one of the two, Elkhart, I think, because the turbo wasn't ready. it had to be coming out of Mosport to Elkhart, because we sat for 3 hours at customs to get clearance, because the car was sent over to Holbert from March on them not having their turbo car ready in time, so he could run that likewise in the early days of the IMSA that year, early races. So it was brought in on one of these 1-year Carnet deals, and customs had the records, and they were saying this car came in through Thousand Islands, and why is it coming out through Detroit that many months later or so? So obviously I would think, I don't know the background for sure, but with Kemper Miller's background with Gannett Corporation and all that, they must have talked them into what happened is legitimate. We're not trying to sneak something over the border or anything. But we got the car out to Elkhart and put the Red Lobster bannering over the CRC bannering. And that's how we had the third car. And finally getting the Porsche ready, bringing that, the only test session at the end of that season was a run at Atlanta briefly, and the conversion to the turbo Porsche was being done by Clem down at Fabcar.
Dave Clement.
Excellent fabricating man, and I spent the winter many weeks down there with them to do that conversion. And we got it all together and had it ready for the Daytona 24-hour the following year. But our test session proved to us that, without a doubt, to me and Dave, that it's going to blow the seals out of the intercooler. He had made up the intercooler from, I think, Mack truck intercoolers, and the face value of where the caps would go on were flat aluminum, and he made gaskets up because we were running out of time. No question, we were heavily time framed. I was sleeping on the floor of Fabcar's office.
Wow.
We were working 30 hours a day, 8 days a week.
Yeah, yeah.
So we knew the car would not last the 24 hours. And we were not even going to come. But Kemper and David sat on the phone for a good 3 hours, said, we've got to be there. This is Red Lobster's home grounds. We've got to have the car there. So we arrived dead last, missed qualifying, missed practice. Cower is a sponsor of the Daytona. This had to be the Sebring event then that we got it running for. Boy, my memory. I'd have to look at records. Anyhow, we did get it running, blah, 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 and we ran a couple races with it, and we had a Porsche guy come over and introduced himself. He says, I was working with Porsche when you guys were making this conversion, and everything you were asking us about and what we were going to do, we were saying no to, because that's what March and Porsche were building on their car, and they didn't want a privateer to show up with the first Porsche March.
A factory, yeah.
They were sabotaging you to the depth that I quit. He couldn't stand it anymore. So that's not right.
Yeah. Wow.
You guys were going down the right path. We wanted to put the turbo over the back of the transaxle, and they said, oh, too much heat. You'll be frying the tranny. We put it on the side. The plumbing that Fabcar had to make out of Inconel tubing because of the temperature, that stainless isn't high enough. I think it goes to 2,800 degrees with Inconel. and it was at $75 per inch of tubing. The headers on that car alone were well over $12,000 that they spent to mount the turbo over there. And the intercooler up top, likewise. Oh no, if you take the air away from that little scoop that they had going in for the down air of 4 Weber carburetors or fuel injection, that'll hurt the air to the wing and the car won't handle good. Well, you know where all their scoops ended up, massive scoops on their intercoolers up there. And in a later time period, I said, likewise, what's the air cools up here, Oscar Kemper? I keep calling him Oscar. I lost Oscar 2 years ago. We lost him, so he's still in my mind. I said, you know, the fan, cooling fan on these turbos in for Porsche engines is sucking air down over the engine. Could we duct that up to the intercooler to help cool? Because we measured 300 degrees in the intercooler temperature, so the air after the turbos, they get pretty damn hot. And I wanted to exit air. Now you're blowing it out the bottom of the Porsche. I wanted to cut a hole in the Venturis and let it go down the, oh no, you'll kill
Aerodynamics, yeah.
So all that was going on at the Holbrook cars.
Yeah.
And he said, you guys are getting sabotaged and you were doing a good job, but they could not stand having a privateer show up first.
Yeah. Yep.
The
Wow.
politics of racing
Yeah.
are deep.
So, the 83G, that was Chevy powered, correct?
Chevy powered, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that car.
We had no basic problem with it other than March's use of the DG 300 Hewlin, and it was a constant breaking of gears and pieces. In the in the last couple years of my involvement with them, I left in '83 for health reasons at home with my mother and father and my own health. So the couple of Brits came over from the March factory to finish off the Red Lobster 2 years of sponsorship. And at one point somebody came by and said, boy, Kemper David wishes you guys were back. Says these Brits are driving them crazy. So what are they doing? I said, well, like the gearboxes are being rebuilt 100% every race. All new gearing, all new shafts. Says, and being Brits, they like to party a lot. Says they're driving everybody crazy.
Wow.
But when we got the car back, after it was sold initially, they sold it to Camel, RJ Reynolds, and they used both cars for display purposes and had it painted up in Camel colors. And at the end of that contract, they bought them back, and we ended up having them both back here in the garage. And I converted the 82 back to a BMW motor, and that car is now being owned by Eros Giraldi up in Toronto. And on the 83 car is the one with the lobster on it. At the 82 end of season, we were deciding about what to do about paint. And I had commented that the fenders on these more stick out so much like a bunch of lobster claws. So they all picked up on the idea of being a good idea, and Lobster hired an artist to draw out what the car should look like. And I was told to just have it painted white for Daytona. And the artist will lay out on the car.
All the artwork.
And people, my wife, Terry and Elaine and other people from down in Florida all painted in the red.
Wow.
And that was the birth of the Lobster. With the turbo back up on the turbo car, the knowing it's not going to go, the third driver was going to be Mauricio de Navarez,
Mhm.
who brought a helmet over and asked me to put lettering. I said, Diego, you're not going to need it. He says, we're not going to last long enough for David and Kemper to have their stints. And it obviously blew. But later on, when Diego was involved in a ride with, boy, I'm getting some of these mixed up, I think. My memory bank is on two different rails. At Sebring, he was a third driver. And a photographer comes over to me and says, I didn't know what was coming down the back street there, back in the warehouse area, but I knew whatever it was, he's not going to make this turn he was standing on. And he says, I was ready for a crash, and sure enough, in came the lobster, crash, bang, boom. I got a beautiful photo. I hope it comes out. It was all pre-digital days.
Yeah.
And he caught a photo of the windshield leaving the march. Up in the air, pieces and parts all over. Diego put it in and finished it.
How many times did you paint that lobster over the course of the years?
Well, when it was first painted, the people at Red Lobster loved it, and they commented that what I'd like you to do, Jack, is make templates, so in case you have to paint it again. Their background must have been drag racing from out of Orlando, Florida, where the big drag strip of Gainesville is,
Yeah.
where you could paint a car and run it all year.
Sure.
So I did, after that crash, I did try it to make with, and halfway through that, I said, this isn't gonna work. I don't have the time to play this artistry. So I said, just give me the car in white, the body shop. Do the body work, whatever, give it to you in white. And I took a piece of 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch
Final tape.
striping tape,
Yep.
masking tape, and just literally threw the
Freeform.
lobsters and then mask it off, and they would paint the red, and then I would take that off and hand paint the aqua and the black outlines of the lobster. And I did that about 16 times.
Only 16 times.
And at one of the races during that time period, again, names of photographers, I can't remember, he's from Atlanta. Jolly, is that a photographer's name?
Yeah.
I,
Hal Crocker's down there, and Jolly. He's
Jolly.
Yeah.
He come over and said, somehow the lobster doesn't look mean this time. I said, yeah, I can't get his eyes to look mean. He says, he has a different look every look. It's driving us crazy.
A different look every time. So I want to talk about liveries a little bit. You know,
It was the first time we were awarded or commented about a team using the entire shape of the car as their logo.
right.
It was attempted by other teams in prior years, but nowhere near. There was somebody that had a bear of some sort, but it was a teddy bear type of thing, and it never looked good.
So going back just a little bit, I want to talk about the livery on the Can-Am car, Oscar's car, the slot car track. Tell me a little bit about the slot car track
Oscar,
on that.
the time period of SCCA going professional, because SCCA technically is an amateur event, amateur club. To go professional, they had to come up with more rules and regulations, IRS and all that. And one of them was maintaining the simplicity of advertising on the cars. If you remember, the early cars were basic paint with a circle for the car number, and I think the limited to 4 or 5 inches by 15 inches for advertising. If you recall, the early Penske cars were Sunoco on the Lola was in Sunoco blue car and Sunoco yellow. And one of the tricks Roger pulled was all the little sponsor decals that you could put below driver axle height
Right.
on the car, but not up top. All of those decals, the format was kept the same, but no matter what colors the sponsor was, it was now blue and yellow,
Mm-hmm.
Sunoco colors.
Right.
And they finally got permission to use Sunoco on the rear fenders.
Mm-hmm.
And that was about it, and they were being pressured by whoever to watch out for commercialization of the Can-Am.
Mm-hmm.
So when Oscar got involved with the 882G, what's he gonna do for coloring? So he decided to make vinyl stick-ons of a slot car track. To you and I, we recognized it immediately as a slot car track, and so did.
And that's that car. That's that car.
Yeah, that is that car
Right.
with the gray stripes.
Right.
And when we were questioned about it, Oscar said, "No, they're not anything to do with anything. They're racing stripes."
Oscar being the promoter, always promoting.
Being the promoter, yes.
Right.
He said, "No, they're just promoting. Their Auto World is my business. That's small. They're just racing stripes."
Right.
So he called to talk to Mattis and the other group, and they're shaking their heads, you know. You can't argue with Oscar. You either agree with him. He was quite the motor mouth.
He was.
If anybody knows Oscar, they'll know Oscar by his push.
Oh yeah.
So they agreed to allow it to run as the Auto World XLR because he was a Castrol oil producer.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the amount of advertising we were allowed on the car. Once they agreed that they were okay, at the next couple of races, we had the little stick-on cars, slot cars.
Right.
The right behind number 54, you can see how the bottom of the Castrol decal is cut off.
Yep.
Well, what you can't see there is the little air deflector.
In front of it.
About 1.5 inches, 2 inches high,
Right.
that goes across
The whole front of the car.
the air exit of radiator heat to get the air to come out and go up and over the windshield, because prior to that, the hot air of the radiator would come right up over the windshield and smack you in the face
Right.
and really get drivers overheated.
Right.
So Bruce and the rest of the gang, who were just getting into aerodynamics, they decided that that would do it nicely. So along with the slot car track, I had that aluminum deflector left in aluminum, and I had it painted up like a grandstand.
With the people in the grandstand.
People in the grandstand.
Uh,
And ever since then, you can see what the car is now. You have to look for the car number.
Well, going into another area, you know, you're as far as an art, you know, and you've done artistry on cars. You're also very much into photography and taking, you know, throughout your entire career, throughout your life, you've taken a tremendous amount of photos of drivers, of cars, of.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. How did you get into taking photos? How did you get into that?
I just became a camera bug way back in high school days as to what to do, and I was looking at there's a big school of some sort down there that was teaching photography, and I took a couple lessons down there for that. I liked photography. I always had a camera hanging around my neck and took a lot of photos. My goal was basically mechanical things, always motors and suspensions and all that. Looking back, it should have been drivers as well.
Which you did. You did a
I
lot
did
of
a
that
few,
too.
but not as much as I could have and should have.
Yeah.
With the drivers and the people we knew by name, Roger and Mario Andretti and Deren Bill, they'll all say, "How you doing, Jack? Long time. How you doing?" You know. So yeah, we had a lot of good friends over the years.
Well, what do you say? Let's go to lunch.
Sarah should be arriving